Hey class, today we're going to go ahead and review ecology. So we're going to do our ecology notes. And in today's lecture, you guys are going to learn that ecology is the study of the relationships among organisms and their environment. So we're going to see how organisms interact with their environment and their effect on the environment as well. Okay. So let's go ahead, and as we notice in this photo, we see some sort of bird. Looks like it's eating a fish. It's the interaction. Okay, ecologists study environments at different levels of organization. So we know that ecology is the study of the interactions among living things and between living things and their surroundings. Please know that you guys need to know the vocabulary terms for ecology. So you need to know the definition. And ecology is the study of interactions among living things and their surroundings, as we see here. So an organism is an individual level thing, living thing such as an alligator. Now, in the last section of notes, we talked about the levels of organization. We went from atoms all the way up to the organism. So now we're going to go ahead and pick up. We're looking at the bigger level. So right here is our organism. Our organism is considered one level or one individual living thing in our whole big picture. Okay? A population, on the opposite hand, is a group of the same species that lives in one area. So now population would be like a population of alligators. A single one is an organism. A group of them together is a population. Next, we look at a community. So a community is a group of different species that live together in one area. So a group of species that lives together in one area. So now we're looking at the alligators, we're looking at the eagles and the fish, and all of the different types of birds as well. An ecosystem includes all of the organisms as well as the climate, the soil, the water, the rocks, and other non-living things in a given area. So when we look at an ecosystem, it's an area that has a specific climate, it has specific soil, and it has certain organisms that live in that area that are adapted to that system, okay? And then finally, we look at biome. And biome is a major regional or global community of organisms characterized by the climate conditions and plant communities that thrive there. So when we look at biomes, we're looking at like the tundra, we're looking at the rainforest, we're looking at the polar ecosystems. And what we see in those types of ecosystems is that they're global communities. They're much larger, and they're found around different parts of the world. They're found around different parts of the world. An ecosystem includes both biotic and abiotic factors. So an ecosystem is going to include both biotic and abiotic factors. Biotic factors are anything that is living. So like we said, if we look at the term bio means life. So bio means life. Some of the living things that we are going to look at include our plants, our animals, our fungus, bacteria. Let's go back. And our bacteria. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at all these pictures. These are all different types of organisms, as we see. We have our bacteria. We also have our fungus, such as our mushrooms and our different types of fungal spores here, our animals, and our plants. Anything that is considered abiotic is non-living. So abiotic factors affect ecosystems and biomes, the non-living parts. And those non-living parts are going to include moisture, you see here, temperature, the sun, wind, and sunlight, as well as our soil. Okay, so it makes sense. All of these things are going to determine whether or not we have an abundance of plants and animals. So once again, our levels of biological organization, if we look at them in general, we start with the atoms. Atoms make molecules. Okay, molecules then make cells. Cells form to make tissues. Tissues form to make organs. Organs work together to make our organ systems. Our organ systems work to make us, who is the organism. Groups of organisms are known as a population. Different types of populations that work together form a community. Communities form our ecosystems, which ultimately form our biosphere, or the living part of Earth. All right, here's a video for you guys to review. It's called The Biological Levels of Organization. So when you get a chance, go ahead and watch this video as it talks about the systems that we just talked about. All right, whenever we change one factor in an ecosystem, it can affect many other factors. Biodiversity is the assortment or variety of living things in an ecosystem. Biodiversity. So please make sure to know this term, as you will be tested on this term. So biodiversity, so bio meaning life. So here's our life word, and then the diverse, or the different species, variety of living systems. Rainforests have the most biodiversity than any other locations in the world, but they are threatened by human activities. Now, why do rainforests have the most biodiversity? Well, there is a ton of plants. So if we have an area that has a high amount of foliage or a lot amount of plants, then you're going to have a high amount of insects or herbivores. We have a lot of insects, and that means that we're going to have a high amount of omnivores or carnivores. So we have those organisms that eat the insects, and then we have our higher order organisms which eat those other types of organisms. So lots of plants, lots of animals, lots of biodiversity. A keystone species is a species that has an unusually large effect on its ecosystem. They form and they maintain a complex web of life. So the two examples that we have seen so far are the wolves of Yellowstone as well as the sea otters. And like we see, if we see this bridge, our keystone is right here in the middle. If I take this keystone away, so if I were to get rid of my keystone species, then what happens to my arch? Yep, it's going to go crumbling down. All right, life in an ecosystem requires a source of energy. So our next section is life in an ecosystem requires a source of energy. Now notice all of these photos here. We see these organisms obtaining energy in various different shapes and forms. Producers provide energy for other organisms in an ecosystem. Producers get their energy from non-living resources. Producers are also called our autotrophs because they make their own food. So all of our producers are going to be our plants. So I just remember P for producers, P for producers. So they get their energy from non-living resources such as the sun. They're also called our autotrophs because they make their own food. So you need to know this term, autotroph and producer. If you get confused, just think about when you go to the market, when you go to the produce section, you are eating the producers or the plants. And all of those organisms make their own food. They make their own food. Consumers are organisms that get their energy by eating other living or once living resources. Okay, so a consumer is an organism that gets its energy by eating something else. So same thing, you need to know what a consumer is as well. Okay, consumers are also called heterotrophs, because they feed off of different things. So a consumer is a heterotroph. So please make sure to know these two terms as well. Heterotrophs need to eat off of other different things or off of other different types of organisms. They do not make their own type of food. Almost all producers obtain energy from sunlight. Photosynthesis in most producers uses sunlight as an energy source. Chemosynthesis in prokaryotic producers uses chemicals as an energy source. So if I look at these two photos here, we see our sunlight, and then we see all of our plants. So as we see, these producers are going to use the sunlight as its source of energy to make its own food. Here we have our sulfurous lakes. Now, in here, we have microscopic organisms that live in this water. Well, how do they survive if the water is scalding and full of acids? So these organisms have found a way to use the chemicals as their source of energy. So the bacteria that are living in here, because they are life, there is life that lives in here, they use the chemicals to convert into energy as opposed to sunlight. And that's known as chemosynthesis. All right, let's talk about food chains and food webs. So food chains and food webs model the flow of energy in an ecosystem. So we want to see how energy is passed on from one organism to another. And we use what is known as a food web and a food chain. A food chain is a model that shows a sequence of feeding relationships. A food chain links species by their feeding relationships. It follows the connection between one producer and a single chain of consumers within an ecosystem. So here's an example of a very small food chain. We have grass, we have the cottontail rabbit, and then we have the Harris hawks. Notice that we have these arrows flowing upward. That means that the direction of energy is going up. The hawk eats the cottontail, and the cottontail eats the grass. So as we can see, the hawk is going to get its energy from the cottontail is then going to get its energy from the grass. This here is one food chain in this ecosystem. Here are some other examples of food chains. So we see corn, rat, owl. Owl eats rat, rat eats corn. Carrot, rabbit, fox, lion. Lion eats fox, fox eats rabbit, rabbit eats carrots. And here's a very extended food chain. Grass, grasshopper, frog, python, eagle. And as we could see, it's the same thing. Eagle eats the python, python eats the frog, frog eats grasshopper, grasshopper gets its energy from the sun. And as we could see, our producers are the bases of all of these food chains. Producers are the bases of all of these food chains. All right, let's look at our types of consumers. So these are terms that you are going to see that I'm hoping you have already learned sometime in your school life. So herbivores eat only plants. Herbivores eat only plants, and they are a consumer. Carnivores eat only animals. Omnivores eat both plants and animals. Detrivores eat dead organic matter. And decomposers are detrivores that break down organic matter into simpler compounds. Every term that is here that is underlined, you will need to know. You will need to know them. So please make sure to review them. So we have a herbivore eats plants. We see here with our koala. A carnivore eats only animals. That here would be like an example of a spider. Okay. An omnivore eats plants and animals. So bear is actually an omnivore. It's going to eat fish, but it also eats berries. Okay. Detrivores eat dead organic matter, like we see here, such as this raven. And then decomposers are detrivores that break down organic matter into smaller matter, such as our earthworms and our bacteria, as well as our fungus. All right, trophic levels are the nourishment levels in a food chain. So whenever we form a food chain, we use what are known as our trophic levels. So our primary consumers are our herbivores that eat producers. So at the base of all of our food chains is going to be our producers, So as we see here, here's our producers. The first step in our food chain is going to consist of a primary consumer, and that is going to always be the herbivore. Okay? They eat the grass, so they're going to be primary. The next one is going to be our secondary consumer. Our secondary consumer are carnivores that eat herbivores. So in this instance, it's going to be the bird, which eats the grasshopper. Our tertiary consumers are our carnivores that eat our secondary consumers. Our carnivores that eat our secondary consumers. Okay. Omnivores, such as humans that eat both plants and animals, may be listed at different trophic levels in different food chains. So if you're an omnivore, you can either be a secondary or a tertiary consumer. Secondary or tertiary consumer. So they eat first, second, third, and then our apex, which is not located on here, our apex predator is the top predator. They're the top of the food chain. They're the top of the food chain. Okay, a food web shows a complex network of feeding relationships. So a food chain just shows one link, whereas a food web shows many different links. An organism may have multiple feeding relationships in an ecosystem, as we see here. A food web emphasizes complicated feeding relationships and energy flow in the ecosystem. So let's see how we read these. All right, notice, like we said, at the bottom of all of our food chains and our food webs is going to be our producers. So in this instance here, it's going to be our plants, our flowers, our seeds, our fruits, and then our nuts, okay? Then we have our primary consumers, and our primary consumers are going to be all of our herbivores. So these organisms here all eat these different types of producers. Then we get our secondary consumers, and they eat our primary consumers. And then same thing, which is our top consumer. So let's look at the raven. So notice that we have 1, 2, 3, 4 different arrows pointing to the raven. What does that mean? The raven can eat the pika. The raven can eat the tree frog. Whoops, let me go back. The raven can eat the checker-spotted moth, and it can also eat the squirrel. So raven just doesn't eat one organism, it eats several organisms. And in a food web, we see that these organisms not just don't eat one thing, they eat multiple items, as we see here. Okay. The jackrabbit, as we see, can eat the pika, it eats the frog, it also eats the moth, and it eats the squirrel. It eats the same items as the raven. Okay. A mountain lion is going to eat this whiptail, it's going to eat the jackrabbit, and it's going to eat the mule deer and the marten. Okay. All right, so this here's an example of a food web. Notice once again how the arrows are pointing upward because the energy is going up. It's going up the food web. All right, finally, we have an energy pyramid. An energy pyramid shows the distribution of energy amongst the trophic levels. Like we see on the pyramid, the base is going to have the most amount of energy or the most amount of organisms. As we climb upwards, here on our energy pyramid, we see that the energy becomes less and the organisms become less as well. So between each tier of energy pyramid, up to 90% of the energy is lost into the atmosphere as heat. So every time we go up, it loses 90% of the energy. So that means that so if I take 100 from 90, what percentage is passed on? So it's going to be only 10%. So we kind of call this the 10% rule. So 10% gets passed on. All right, what does that look like? Okay, so let's say, for example, the energy obtained in the grass is 10,000 kilojoules, okay? Once we go up, remember only 10% gets utilized, so 10%. So the amount that these organisms have, so we're gonna take off one of these arrows, is going to be 1,000. We're gonna go up, it's gonna be 100 here. And as we go up, it's going to be 10, okay? Why is that important? notice that, remember when we talked about as you go up the energy pyramid, the numbers of organisms decrease. Okay, now I have one of these hawks here. Okay, now as you said, the hawk doesn't have as much energy. In order for it to obtain more energy, it needs to eat multiple amounts of snakes or multiple amounts of rabbits to obtain the energy that it needs. Okay, and in terms of reproduction, why would I not want there to be more? Why don't I want there to be more hawks than snakes? So take a minute to think about that. Why would I not want there to be more hawks than snakes? Good. I'm hoping you said that. If you had more hawks than snakes, then what would happen is the hawks would start competing for the snakes and their population will decrease, So as we go up the food chain and the food pyramid, the numbers of organisms decrease. Like we said, only 10% of the energy at each tier is transferred from one trophic level to the next. So only 10% of the energy at each tier is transferred from one trophic level to the next. All right, here's a video on the amoeba sisters. It talks about the food webs, food chains, and energy pyramids. Please be sure to watch this video. Okay. All right, that is all for our lecture today. If you have any other questions, please reach out to your teacher. Other than that, you guys have an amazing day.